Hello, my name is Margaret Adele, and for years I heard that same old saying that has been said around BookTube for who knows how long, and that is zero TBRs don't work. You can't read down your owned books until you've read every single one of them. That's just not possible. And I did think that until I did it. And for a glorious 2 hours in August of 2024, I had read every single book I owned. And I've made a lot of content about that at this point. I talked about how I did it, what life is like after hitting zero, and some tips and tricks for other people to do the same. So we're going to follow that through with why do people think that zero TBRs just don't work? Granted, they're a lot more popular now, so it seems that more people are hopeful that they are possible, even though most people doing those, reading down my TBR challenges aren't necessarily going for a perfect zero. They're just going for a more manageable number like 100 or 50. Personally, I have no idea how I considered any number above 35 reasonable, because even now I start getting stressed whenever my TBR gets that high. But regardless, we are going to talk about the pitfalls, the stumbling blocks, and the kind of warning signs to look for to make sure that you're giving your zero TBR or your read down your TBR challenge the best shot of success. A quick note on who these videos are for before we continue, because I tend to get a lot of comments on my zero TBR videos of things like, well, I actually like having hundreds and hundreds of books. And okay, these videos aren't for you. My zero TBR videos are kind of predicated on the idea that you want to have a better control of the books you own and actually be reading them. And it could be for a variety of reasons. Maybe you want to participate less in capitalism. Maybe you've learned the sheer extent of the ecological impact that buying a lot of newly manufactured goods, including books, has, and you'd like it to be less on your part. Maybe you just have a small living place and you really can't afford to keep all these books you have and you need to start weeding through them. Regardless, whatever it is, this video is for you. And if you're not one of those people, if you want to have a giant TBR, I mean, cool, you can give me the views, but you probably won't get that much out of this. Let's jump right in with stumbling block number 1, underestimating the time it's going to take. Because I have seen a lot of people, when they talk about their lower the TBR challenges, referring to it as a goal for the calendar year, by the end of 2025 or what have you. That is way too quick a turnaround time. Unless your TBR was already under what you read in a year, that's probably not going to happen. And in all honesty, if your TBR is at that point, you probably don't have a really big problem where you need to do a challenge like this. But regardless, my challenge took me 2.5 years. Now, I did take off some months just to prevent burnout, but even then, I wasn't going super crazy, and the rest of the time, it was no exceptions. You have to read down the books to unlock getting new books. And still, 2.5 years. So, this is not something you're going to accomplish in a single year, and it will be very disappointing if you set yourself up for something like that and then don't accomplish it when it was never realistic to accomplish that in that time frame in the first place. But the good news is, if you're one of those content creators using it for content, you're set for a while. It'll just keep going. But also it's very important because aside from the mathematical properties of, the rate of decrease, it's also very important to give your brain time to unlearn old habits and relearn new habits, right? Because if you do all that work to get your TBR down to zero, but you still haven't really changed anything, you're probably going to end up right back where you started within a couple of years. But if you give yourself time to really get into it and really examine yourself and your reading, it'll work a lot better for you in the long term. Like I jokingly mentioned before, my TBR doesn't really get above 35 ever. In fact, these days, it's rare for it to get above 25. And that was because I built a lot of habits over a long period of time. So give yourself grace. Give yourself time. You're going to need it. Stumbling block number 2, you have the wrong setup. Now, it's a little bit difficult to give a hard and fast, this is the right setup and this is the wrong setup, because it's entirely dependent on your own brain. For me, I actually had an earlier attempt at a zero TBR that failed because my setup was too strict. Originally, I had it where I had to read 3 books I owned before I could get one new one. And it went really well, and I was bringing down the TBR really fast until I burned out within like 2 months. So I quickly learned when I tried again, because yes, you are allowed to try this again, that I need to go with only 2. It meant that the decrease was slower, but also more sustainable. Because again, this is going to take you a while. And for me, it needed to be very simplistic. Just the 2. At one point, I was doing it where I could unhaul 10 to get a new one, or mix and match, unhaul 5, read 1. But that was in the early days when I just had so many books that I could easily unhaul. And regardless, I needed something that simplistic, because anything more complicated and I'd be like, whoop. And I have seen some much more complicated setups here where with like boards and you mark stuff off in different categories, and if that is to your taste, gods go with you. But I cannot imagine doing that. So you might need to like play around with how strict versus how lenient your setup should be, and how simplistic versus how complicated. Don't just copy what an influencer is doing if it doesn't work for you. If you look at that board with the different categories and everything and you're like, I am so overwhelmed, you probably need a more simplistic setup. And if you're like, ugh, I just read down 2, that's so boring, you probably need a more complicated setup. But regardless, whatever one you pick, it's perfectly okay to be like, actually, JK, this isn't working, I need to switch. Anything that you do to read down your TBR is going to help. The trick is something that is sustainable and keeps your attention for the long term. Stumbling block number 3 is not the most controversial on this list, but it's also not the least, and that is way too many exceptions to the rule. I have seen this happen way too many times. A booktuber comes out with a new lower the TBR challenge, and of course my YouTube algorithm is so set to underconsumption content, so I get served it and I get really excited, but I wait. As I watch, I wait until they get to the part with their exceptions. And so many times, they will not only have more than 1 or 2 exceptions, they will have whole categories of exceptions. Oh yeah, I'm not including any of my book boxes, or any ARCs from publishers, or any gifts from friends and family. And at that point, I know there's not really any point in subscribing. I'm still going to leave an encouraging comment, because I hope I'm wrong, but more than likely, they're going to give up within 6 months. For a couple of reasons. One, you've just mathematically hamstrung yourself, because now to actually get the number on your TBR lower, you have to read as many books as your exceptions, plus all the books you unlock in your challenge. Meaning, depending on how many exceptions you bring in, you could cut your progress down by half or even to a fourth. The catch is that it's still going to feel like a lot of work. It's going to feel like you're putting in effort and seeing so little return, and it's going to be incredibly demoralizing. But more important than that, you're just not letting the zero TBR actually do what it does best, which is make you rethink the books you're bringing in. There's this old concept when it comes to budgeting and mindful consumption that you should think about your purchases in the manner of hours you had to work to get it. So say you work an hourly job for $10 an hour and you want to get a book that is $25. Is that book worth the 2.5 hours you had to work to earn that money? Similarly, a zero TBR says, do you really want this book enough to have to read 2 other books to get it? Because if you're already making them automatic exceptions, there's a very good chance that no, your brain doesn't actually think they're that worth it, because they're not worth not being exceptions. If that book box is bringing so much into your life, it should be a no-brainer to read a couple books the month before and leave that slot open when it's time to get that new book. And if you really, really don't want to do that, examine if you really, really want that book box. That's the kind of concept. And yes, this could mean having some awkward conversations of, oh, hey, actually, I'm not accepting any ARCs or any books at this time, or I'll let you know when I can accept a single book. they can be awkward conversations to have. And believe me, I've just gotten used to having a lot of awkward conversations with indie authors that send me review requests. Because at one point, I tried to have review books be exceptions to the rule. And that was in the challenge that failed. And the one that succeeded did not have those exceptions. Now, one or two could be helpful for things like just giving yourself a break. You forgot the book box was coming, and so you didn't open a slot ahead of time. You're like, oh, crap. One or two won't break the challenge. But if you have whole categories of exceptions, I just don't think you want to do this that much. Like, really examine, do you want to have this entire process play out, or is it just fun to make this kind of content? Stumbling block number 4 was my personal biggest, and that is being in denial. Not being honest with yourself about the kind of reader you are, about whether or not those sources are actually giving you books you want to read. It is so difficult. I used to assume that I was the very cerebral reader that read the surreal horror and the hard sci-fi, and I am not. I love kitschy, melodramatic ass nonsense. You know, like the urban fantasy with the CW levels of angst. It hits. And it was so hard to come to that conclusion of just, I'm not that kind of reader. I want to be perceived as that kind of reader, but I'm not. And finally letting go of the reader I thought I was to allow myself to revel in the kind of reader I am was such a turning point. It was so good. It was hard, but the end goal is so amazing because now I am so locked in. Not just to the specific genres I like, but the tropes and the general vibe. And that doesn't mean that I never get outside my comfort zone, but that is what the library is for. However, I still see people trying to include like hyped books of genres they're not all that interested in their challenges. Like, again, you have to put an effort just to unlock the chance to get those books. You're gonna have to put in more effort to really think, is this worth it? Do I really want it? Likewise, you also have to be really honest with yourself about whether or not your sources are actually serving you. So many of us fall into the trap of, well, yeah, the majority of these books I get from this source I don't really like, but there was that one time I got that really good book, so clearly I need to keep reading all of this rough to get to the diamond. Now, again, you might reevaluate and decide, you know what, the rough is worth it. I am really willing to read 3 books I'm not interested in from this source for the chance of getting that one perfect 5-star I know is buried somewhere in there. But again, you have to think to yourself, were those 3 books worth it to get to that one? For me, my weakness was BookBub. I used to download every single free ebook on BookBub for the longest time. In fact, it was the majority of what I had to unhaul in the early days. Because I found 1 or 2 beloved 5-stars, despite the fact that the majority of them were 3 stars, if not DNFs, I kept going back and kept clogging up my e-reader. And letting that go, not checking those emails every day like I had for years, that was also very difficult. But the end result of all of this is I just like all of my books more. I'm just so zoned in, clued in to where I can get the books I want and what kind of books I'm looking for. It's so much better. And that doesn't mean I never try a new place, but that means I give it a couple tries. And if after a couple tries I'm not vibing, that's not a source for me. I'm going to find different sources. Like, for example, I know that I need really curated sources. I don't like a gigantic library that you just have to pick from. But I know I also like any source that is heavily focused on queer books. It's probably going to be a good one for me. But I see it with a lot of other people where, again, they want the challenge in mathematical numbers, but they're not really having a reckoning with their own mindset. And if you don't have that reckoning, you're probably not going to get to the finish line. Stumbling block number 5 is the most controversial because it is political, but a 0 TBR is political. Because stumbling block number 5 is not engaging with this challenge as an anti-capitalist challenge. Because it is. It is literally flying in the face of everything every major corporation wants you to believe as someone living under late-stage capitalism. They want you to be constantly purchasing, to be constantly wanting, needing, in need of that next thing, that next serotonin hit of the purchase. They want you to have a gigantic amount of material goods. And they also want you to think that books are the magical unicorn that have no ecological impact. They do a ton of it, and I'm trying so hard not to go on a monologue about all the various ways, but yes, again, book manufacturing takes up non-renewable resources that we cannot get back once they are used, and it is very important to remember that. And yes, books end up in landfills by the millions. They are not the magical unicorn of never ending up in those places. Okay? I really need everybody to understand that. And I think I have just about beaten back my urge to monologue about that. Regardless, this is an anti-capitalist challenge. Like a Project Pan, a Shop Your Shelves, a Project Pantry, a Stash Down. It is saying, I need to be happy with what I have and the money I've already spent, and I need to be more mindful of the things I am bringing into my life. And it is that idea that seems to be the biggest stumbling block for a lot of people. Because even now that these challenges have grown so much more in popularity, people are still trying to keep it very fiercely apolitical, but it's not. It's literally flying in the face of a current societal trend. It has an ethical underpinning to all of it. And until you can reckon with it as that and just treat it as like this fluffy little challenge, you're always going to fail it. And that feels so harsh to say, but like, that's the entire point of it. The challenge is made to make you look at your consumption and look at, am I really bringing in the material goods that are uplifting my life, or am I just shopping to shop? Am I just shopping for the serotonin and then not really caring about the books after a while? Because yeah, when I started unhauling, I was shocked at the sheer amount of books I have that I could not give two fucks about. Not even a little bit, that had seemed so important to buy at the time because, oh, they were on sale, they were cheap. And as someone that was raised in intermittent poverty, the cheapness was what I focused on, not is this object really bringing that much value into my life? So I'm going to get down off the soapbox. This is still very important to engage with in that way. Like I mentioned before in other points, a zero TBR is at its best when you let it have an effect on your mind, when you let it have an effect on how you think about books and the effort you put into getting books and what you actually like in books and what sources are serving you in the books you get. When you let it do that and let it become a tool for evaluation on your reading as an entire hobby, that's when it works. That's when you can finally start to see where you're bringing in random objects that you don't actually care that much about, where you're not being very honest with yourself about the kind of things you genuinely want to engage with. That's where it's at its best. And if you can't view it through that lens, then yeah, zero TBR is impossible. Thank you so much for watching. I think I have finally come to the end of all of my zero TBR content. I literally can't think of another kind of video I could make off of this idea. But again, it took me 2.5 years, so I needed to make at least a decent chunk of videos on it. Regardless, if you do have any more questions about what it was like to do a zero TBR, what life is like a year later, the trickiness of trying to participate in readathons and reading challenges when you have a small TBR. Actually, you know what? Never mind. I did just think of another video I could make. Anyway, regardless, I would love to know if you're on a challenge similar to this, zero TBR, or just getting your TBR lower. If you have any personal stumbling blocks that were not mentioned here, please let me know. Maybe we can brainstorm solutions to them together. And with nothing else to say, I hope you have a wonderful day and a marvelous tomorrow.